before there was the White House, Hollywood, and McDonald's. What was this land? Let's go back in time. Imagine this. You standing in the middle of North America in the year 1400. There are no roads, no skyscrapers, no country called the United States. Just vast forests, sprawling plains, and winding rivers. Around you are millions of people, living in thousands of different societies, each with their own languages, beliefs, and ways of life. This is their home. So how did this place, in just a few hundred years, become a global superpower that would change the world forever? That's the story we're going to tell. This is the story of America, before it was America. Forget the old movies. The people who lived here weren't just roaming bands of hunters. They were farmers who cultivated corn, beans, and squash in the fertile river valleys. They were architects who built massive earthwork mounds in sprawling cities like Cahokia near modern-day St. Louis, which was larger than London at the time. They were traders, connected by intricate networks that stretched for thousands of miles, moving goods like obsidian from the Rockies and seashells from the Gulf Coast. They were astronomers, philosophers, and storytellers. This was a continent buzzing with life, innovation, and ancient traditions. But across the Atlantic Ocean, another world was stirring. In Europe, powerful empires were clashing, fueled by ambition, religion, and an insatiable hunger for trade. They were looking for new routes to the riches of Asia, and their ships were getting better and better. They were ready to push the boundaries of their known world. And one day, on the horizon of the Americas, strange new shapes would appear. Imagine being a member of the Taino people, living on a Caribbean island. One morning, you see something you've never seen before. Massive wooden structures with giant white cloths, floating on the water, carrying people with pale skin and strange clothes. This was the moment two worlds collided. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but he wasn't the first or the last. He opened the floodgates. Soon, Spanish conquistadors were searching for gold, French fur traders were paddling down the great rivers, and Dutch merchants were setting up trading posts. But our story zooms in on the English. In 1607, a group of them landed in a swampy part of Virginia and called it Jamestown. This wasn't a glorious beginning. They were looking for a quick profit, but instead, they found starvation, disease, and conflict. The air was thick with desperation and the smoke from a new cash crop, tobacco. This land was not empty. It was someone else's homeland, the land of the Powhatan Confederacy. At first, there was cautious trade and exchange of knowledge, but misunderstanding quickly turned to mistrust, and mistrust to violence. A little further north, another group of English settlers arrived, but for very different reasons. The Pilgrims and Puritans weren't just looking for wealth. They were fleeing religious persecution back home. They wanted to build a city upon a hill, a new society based on their strict religious beliefs. In places like Plymouth and Boston, they established tight-knit communities centered around the church and the town meeting. They were tough, determined, and deeply convinced of their divine mission. But their arrival also displaced and devastated the local peoples, like the Wampanoag and the Narragansett, through disease and war. A pattern was emerging: European arrival, initial cooperation, and then a brutal struggle for control of the land. Over the next century and a half, these scattered outposts grew into 13 distinct British colonies, stretching along the Atlantic coast. But they were far from united. They were almost like different little countries. In the north, you had colonies like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. Life here revolved around small farms, fishing, and bustling port cities like Boston and Philadelphia. It was a world of merchants, artisans, and shipbuilders. The economy was diverse, and while slavery existed, it wasn't the central pillar of society. The South was a completely different story. In colonies like Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, the economy was built on massive plantations, growing cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. And this entire system was propped up by the brutal institution of chattel slavery. A wealthy, powerful elite of slave-owning planters dominated society and politics. So, with all these differences, why did they all consider themselves British subjects for so long? Well, being part of the British Empire had its perks. The Royal Navy protected their shipping from pirates and rival empires. They had access to a vast global market for their goods. And for the most part, Britain practiced a policy of salutary neglect, meaning they let the colonies govern their own local affairs. It was a pretty good deal, but then, a war changed everything. The French and Indian War, part of a global conflict called the 7 Years' War, saw Britain and its American colonies fighting against France and its Native American allies for control of North America. Britain won, spectacularly, but victory came at a staggering cost. The British government was now drowning in debt, and back in London they started looking at the prosperous colonies across the ocean and thinking, maybe it's time they started paying their fair share for that protection. The feeling in the American colonies started to shift. It began with taxes. To pay off its war debts, the British Parliament started imposing new taxes directly on the colonists. First came the Sugar Act, then the Stamp Act in 1765, which required a tax on all paper goods, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. The colonists were furious. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the principle. A new slogan began to echo through the streets: no taxation without representation. Colonists argued that since they didn't elect any members to the British Parliament, Parliament had no right to tax them. Protests erupted. Groups like the Sons of Liberty organized boycotts of British goods. Tensions escalated. In 1770, on a snowy street in Boston, a confrontation between British soldiers and a crowd of colonists ended with soldiers firing into the crowd, killing 5 people. It was dubbed the Boston Massacre, and images of the event, spread by patriots like Paul Revere, enraged the colonies. Then came the Tea Act. To help the struggling British East India Company, Parliament gave it a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, which actually made tea cheaper. But the colonists saw it as another trick to make them accept Parliament's right to tax them. The breaking point came on a cold December night in 1773. Disguised as Native Americans, a group of colonists boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor. Under the cover of darkness, they smashed open 342 chests of tea and dumped them into the chilly water. A cup of tea hits the water, a quiet splash in the dark, but the ripples from that act would soon be felt across an ocean, and a few years later, an entire empire would shake. The revolution was coming. Imagine you're a British citizen in 1775. Would you believe that 13 poor, scattered colonies dared to revolt against the most powerful empire on earth? The British Empire was a global superpower, with the world's most feared navy and a professional army that had conquered vast territories. On the other side, a collection of farmers, merchants, and artisans, barely united, with no central government, no real army, and certainly no navy to speak of. It sounded like a joke, a quick, decisive rebellion to be crushed in a matter of months. But this wasn't just any rebellion. It was the spark that would ignite a revolution and give birth to a brand new nation. How on earth did this ragtag group of colonists pull off the impossible? Let's find out. The tension that had been simmering for over a decade finally boiled over in April 1775 in the quiet Massachusetts towns of Lexington and Concord. British soldiers, known as Redcoats, marched to seize a colonial weapons cache. They were met by local militiamen, ordinary citizens ready to defend their homes. No one knows for sure who fired first, but that single gunshot became known as the shot heard round the world. It was the point of no return. War had begun. In response, delegates from the colonies gathered for the Second Continental Congress. They needed a leader, someone to unify their patchwork forces. They chose a Virginia planter with military experience from a previous war, George Washington. He was appointed commander-in-chief of the newly formed Continental Army, but calling it an army was generous. Washington's situation was desperate. His soldiers were volunteers, often enlisting for short terms before returning to their farms. They lacked everything: proper uniforms, boots, gunpowder, cannons, and food. The colonies had no real power to levy taxes, so paying for the war was a constant struggle. Desertion was rampant, and morale was often dangerously low. Facing the might of the British military, Washington's task seemed less like leading an army and more like trying to hold back the tide with a sieve. The early days were a string of retreats and narrow escapes. The cause of independence looked bleak. While the fighting raged, a war of ideas was also being fought. At first, many colonists didn't want to break away from Britain. They considered themselves proud Englishmen who just wanted their rights respected, no taxation without representation. But as the conflict dragged on and the king declared the colonies to be an open rebellion, sentiments began to shift. This change was fueled by the powerful ideas of the Enlightenment. Thinkers like John Locke had argued that governments exist only by the consent of the governed, and that all people have natural rights to life, liberty, and property. These weren't just abstract philosophical concepts. They were spreading like wildfire through pamphlets and tavern debates across America. The most influential of these was Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, which argued in plain, forceful language that monarchy was an absurd form of government and that the time had come for America to declare independence. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies and convinced many who were on the fence. So, in the hot summer of 1776, the Continental Congress decided to make it official. They tasked a 33-year-old Virginian named Thomas Jefferson with drafting a formal declaration. Drawing heavily on Enlightenment ideals, Jefferson penned some of the most famous words in history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Imagine being a soldier in the Continental Army, dirty and hungry. Hearing those words read aloud for the first time in a town square, it transformed the fight from a tax dispute into a universal struggle for freedom. But there was a deep, troubling contradiction at the heart of these beautiful words. Jefferson, the man who wrote that all men are created equal, owned over 100 enslaved people. This fundamental conflict between the nation's ideals and the reality of slavery would haunt America for generations to come. Declaring independence was one thing, winning it was another. The war was brutal and uneven. Washington's army suffered a series of crushing defeats around New York. The winter of 1777 to 78 at Valley Forge became a symbol of the army's suffering. Thousands of soldiers died from disease, starvation, and exposure, huddled in crude huts while the British Army lived comfortably in occupied Philadelphia. It was the absolute low point of the war, yet the army did not break. Under the guidance of a Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben, the freezing, starving troops were drilled relentlessly, slowly being forged into a more professional fighting force. But the real game changer came from an unlikely source. France, the French monarchy, Britain's old rival, had been secretly aiding the Americans from the beginning. They saw a golden opportunity to weaken the British Empire by helping the colonies break away. After the Americans won a crucial victory at the Battle of Saratoga, France was convinced that the rebellion might actually succeed. In 1778, they officially recognized the United States and signed a treaty of alliance. Suddenly, the war went global. French money, weapons, soldiers, and most importantly, the powerful French Navy poured in to support the American cause. The war was no longer just 13 colonies against Great Britain. It was now Great Britain against an American-French alliance. The tide began to turn. The final act came in 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia. Washington, in a brilliant move, coordinated with the French Army and Navy to trap the main British force under General Cornwallis. With the French fleet blockading the coast and the combined American and French armies laying siege on land, Cornwallis was cornered. He had no choice but to surrender. The world was stunned. The ragtag rebels had defeated the global superpower. The fighting was effectively over. We won. Now what? Winning the war was an incredible achievement, but the next challenge was just as daunting: building a nation from scratch. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States. But the new country was a mess. The first government, established under the Articles of Confederation, was intentionally weak. The states, fearful of creating a new powerful central authority like the British King, had given the national government almost no power. It couldn't tax, couldn't raise an army, and couldn't regulate trade. The country was basically 13 independent mini-nations loosely tied together. It wasn't working. The economy was in shambles, and the government was powerless to fix it. Recognizing the danger, leaders like Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton called for a convention in Philadelphia in 1787 to fix the articles. But instead of just fixing them, they threw them out and started over, drafting a radical new plan: the United States Constitution. It created a stronger federal government, divided into 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, with a system of checks and balances to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. This sparked a fierce debate across the country between the Federalists, who supported the new constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who feared it would create a new tyranny. As a compromise, a Bill of Rights was promised: 10 amendments that would explicitly protect individual liberties like freedom of speech, religion, and the press. With that, the Constitution was ratified, and George Washington was elected the first president. A democratic experiment has just been switched on. The question is, will it blow itself up? The new nation faced immense challenges, from economic instability to the ever-present shadow of slavery, which was left unresolved. What would happen as this young republic began to expand west? Imagine you're on a horse, dust kicking up around you, nothing but endless sky and untamed land stretching out for miles. It feels like the whole world is yours for the taking. But there's a question that hangs in the air, heavy as a storm cloud. If land is the future, then who deserves to own it? This isn't just some philosophical thought. It's the central question that shaped America, a question that would be answered with treaties, rifles, and rivers of blood. Let's rewind the clock. The United States is just a baby, a thin strip of states clinging to the Atlantic coast. Presidents like Washington, Adams, and Jefferson are trying to figure out how to build a nation from scratch. They look west, and what do they see? Opportunity. Limitless, terrifying, beautiful opportunity. Then, in 1803, comes a deal that sounds almost too good to be true. Napoleon in France needs cash for his wars in Europe, and he has got a piece of real estate he is willing to part with: the Louisiana Territory, for just $15 million. President Jefferson doubles the size of the United States overnight. Think about that. With the stroke of a pen, a landmass stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains becomes American soil. But there's a problem. No one really knows what's out there, so Jefferson sends 2 guys, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, on an epic road trip. Their mission: map this vast new territory, document the plants and animals, and find a water route to the Pacific. Their expedition becomes the stuff of legend, a journey into the heart of a continent that, to them, felt like a blank slate. But it wasn't blank at all. It was home to hundreds of thousands of people who had lived there for centuries. And this is where the dream of expansion starts to show its dark side. As waves of settlers pushed west, they weren't just looking for land, they were taking it. The US government began a series of brutal policies known as Indian removal. The most infamous of these was the Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee, Choctaw, and other nations were forced from their ancestral homes in the southeast and marched thousands of miles to designated Indian territory. Thousands died from disease, starvation, and exhaustion. Imagine having everything you've ever known, your home, your culture, your family's graves ripped away from you. For every settler who found their American dream of owning a small farm and building a future, a native family was losing theirs. This created a stark, tragic contrast. On one hand, the exhilarating promise of a new beginning, and on the other, the systematic destruction of entire peoples. The story of the West is a story of clashing worlds, a violent collision between manifest destiny and ancient homelands. By the 1830s and 40s, this push west became a national obsession, a belief that it was America's manifest destiny, its God-given right to control the continent from sea to shining sea, and the next big prize was Texas. American settlers, many of them slave owners, had moved into the Mexican territory of Texas. Tensions flared, a revolution broke out, and Texas declared itself an independent republic. It wasn't long before it was annexed by the United States. Mexico, understandably, was furious. This dispute over territory led directly to the Mexican-American War. The U.S. military, better equipped and organized, won a decisive victory. In the treaty that followed, Mexico was forced to cede an enormous swath of land, including what would become California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, in just a few short decades. The United States had stretched across the entire continent. The dream of manifest destiny had become a reality. But in conquering the West, America had also sown the seeds of its own destruction. Because every time a new piece of land was added to the country, one question had to be answered: would it be free, or would it allow slavery? This wasn't just a political debate, it was a battle for the soul of the nation. The North was rapidly industrializing, building its economy on factories and free labor. The South, meanwhile, was an agricultural powerhouse, but its entire way of life, its entire economy, was built on the backs of millions of enslaved people. The cotton gin had made slavery more profitable than ever, and Southern leaders were desperate to expand it into the new Western territories. Congress tried to keep the peace with a series of shaky compromises. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 drew a line across the country, saying slavery could exist south of it, but not north. Then the Compromise of 1850 tried another balancing act, but it was like putting a band-aid on a gunshot wound. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 blew everything apart. It allowed settlers in those territories to vote on whether to allow slavery. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, and the territory exploded into a mini-civil war known as Bleeding Kansas. Then the Supreme Court dropped a bombshell with the Dred Scott decision, ruling that African Americans were not citizens and had no rights. The country was a powder keg. In 1860, a man named Abraham Lincoln, who ran on a platform of stopping the spread of slavery, was elected president. For the South, this was the final straw. And then one day, 7 states say, "We're out." The United States officially tears itself in half. The war to define America's future was about to begin.
How does a great nation survive when it's torn apart from within? This wasn't a war against a foreign enemy. It was a war of brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. It was a conflict that would test the very soul of the United States. A brutal, bloody crucible that would either shatter the republic or forge it into something new, something stronger. This is the story of the American Civil War, a nation's darkest hour, and the painful rebirth that followed. In the winter of 1860, the simmering tensions over states' rights, economics, and, most critically, the institution of slavery, finally boiled over. 11 Southern states, fearing the abolitionist sentiment of the newly elected president Abraham Lincoln, seceded from the Union. They formed their own nation, the Confederate States of America, with its capital in Richmond, Virginia. The United States was no longer united. The first shots rang out in April 1861, not on a battlefield, but at a federal fort in Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter. Confederate forces fired on the U.S. garrison, forcing its surrender. The war had begun. Young men, full of patriotic fervor, rushed to enlist on both sides. The common belief, this would be a short, decisive, and honorable affair. They thought they'd be home by Christmas. Both sides were tragically, devastatingly wrong. The war would not be a brief adventure, but a 4-year nightmare that would claim over 620,000 lives. At first glance, the odds seemed stacked heavily in favor of the Union. The North had a population of 22 million, compared to the South's 9 million, a third of whom were enslaved. The Union controlled the nation's industry, its factories, its coal and iron, and a vast network of railroads that could move troops and supplies with unprecedented speed. It also had a powerful navy, which it used to blockade southern ports, strangling the Confederacy's economy. But the Confederacy had its own powerful advantages. It was fighting a defensive war on its own territory. Its soldiers were protecting their homes and their way of life, giving them a powerful, personal motivation. And critically, in the early years, the South had a gallery of brilliant military commanders. Men like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, who consistently outmaneuvered their larger Union counterparts. The result was a series of shocking Confederate victories that stunned the North, but the Union's industrial might and manpower were relentless. The war became a brutal grind of attrition. The Battle of Antietam in 1862 became the bloodiest single day in American history, with over 22,000 casualties. The sheer scale of the carnage was unimaginable. Then came the turning point. In the summer of 1863, General Lee made a bold gamble. Invading the North, his army met the Union forces in a small Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg. For 3 hellish days, the two armies tore into each other. The battle culminated in a disastrous Confederate assault, known as Pickett's Charge. It was a slaughter. Lee's army was broken and forced to retreat. The Confederacy would never again mount a major offensive on Union soil. The tide had turned. In the wake of this crucial victory, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This executive order declared that all enslaved people in the rebellious states were thenceforward and forever free. This was a seismic shift. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now a moral crusade to end slavery. This masterstroke of political and military strategy also had a huge diplomatic impact. By reframing the war as a fight for freedom, it made it nearly impossible for European powers like Britain and France, which had already abolished slavery, to support the Confederacy. The final phase of the war was defined by a new, ruthless strategy of total war. Lincoln promoted Ulysses S. Grant to command all Union armies. Grant understood that to win, he had to destroy the Confederacy's ability to fight, while he relentlessly hammered Lee's army in Virginia. He sent his most trusted general, William Tecumseh Sherman, on a destructive march to the sea. Sherman's army cut a 60-mile-wide path of destruction through Georgia, burning crops, tearing up railroads, and crushing the South's will to continue. The pressure was unbearable. The Confederacy was starving, its armies depleted. On April 9, 1865, at a small farmhouse in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. The long, bloody war was finally over. The nation celebrated, believing the worst was behind them. But the tragedy was not yet complete. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, President Abraham Lincoln, the man who had steered the nation through its darkest trial, was assassinated. The joy of victory turned to shock and grief. The leader who had preached malice toward none, with charity for all, was gone, leaving a fractured nation to heal without its great healer. The period that followed, known as Reconstruction, was a messy, chaotic, and ultimately failed attempt to rebuild the South and integrate millions of newly freed African Americans into society. 3 transformative amendments were added to the Constitution. The 13th abolished slavery, the 14th granted citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th guaranteed the right to vote for black men. On paper, it was a revolution in civil rights. But the reality on the ground was very different. Vicious extremist factions rose up to terrorize black communities and their white allies. Southern states passed discriminatory black codes to control the labor and behavior of former slaves, effectively creating a new system of bondage. By the late 1870s, federal will to enforce Reconstruction had faded, and the promise of equality gave way to a new era of segregation and systemic oppression. At the same time, the rest of the country was experiencing an unprecedented economic explosion. Railroads crisscrossed the continent. Steel mills and oil refineries lit up the sky. Industrial titans like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan amassed fortunes of unimaginable size. Millions of immigrants poured into rapidly growing cities, seeking a piece of the prosperity. It was an age of invention, of wealth, of glittering progress. This was the Gilded Age. The American dream started glowing in gold, but for many, it would soon become clear that it was just a gilded facade, hiding deep social problems underneath. The Civil War had saved the Union and ended slavery, but the struggle for America's soul, the fight to live up to its founding ideals of liberty and justice for all, was far from over. Picture this. The year is 1900. The air is thick with the clang of steel and the roar of machinery. A new century is dawning, and America is a young, energetic giant, flexing its industrial muscles. But it's still just a regional power, looking across the ocean at the old empires of Europe. Now, fast forward just a few years. The scene changes to mud-filled trenches, the sound of artillery fire echoing across a shattered landscape in France. American soldiers, once observers, are now in the thick of it. In less than a lifetime, the United States went from being a new player on the world stage to the world referee. How did this happen? How did a nation, born from a revolution against an empire, become the most powerful empire the world has ever seen? This is the story of America's meteoric rise in the 20th century, a journey of ambition, conflict, and transformation. To understand this transformation, we have to go back to the beginning of the century, to a time known as the Progressive Era. America was bursting with energy, but it was also riddled with problems. Cities were overcrowded, political corruption was rampant, and massive corporations, known as trusts, held a stranglehold on the economy. People had had enough. A wave of reformers rose up, demanding change. They fought for safer working conditions, breaking up monopolies, and giving women the right to vote. It was a period of intense internal house cleaning, an attempt to live up to the nation's founding ideals. While America was busy fixing its own problems, Europe was marching toward disaster. In 1914, the Great War erupted. For 3 long years, the United States stayed officially neutral, watching from the sidelines as the old world tore itself apart. President Woodrow Wilson even won re-election with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But staying out became impossible. German submarines began sinking ships carrying American passengers, and a secret message, the Zimmermann telegram, revealed a German plot to turn Mexico against the US in 1917. America declared war. The arrival of fresh American troops tipped the balance, helping the Allies secure victory. When the dust settled, the old European empires were shattered and broke. America, on the other hand, emerged stronger. It had become the world's bank, lending vast sums of money for the war and Reconstruction. Its global influence had skyrocketed. The war was over, and America was ready to party. The 1920s roared to life, a decade of unprecedented prosperity and cultural change. Jazz music spilled out of clubs. The assembly line put cars in the driveways of average families, and Hollywood began creating a new, glamorous American mythology. It was the age of the flapper, the speakeasy, and a booming stock market that seemed like a one-way ticket to riches. Consumer culture was born. People were buying radios, refrigerators, and stocks on credit, believing the good times would never end, but they did. On a dark day in October 1929, the stock market crashed. The Roaring Twenties came to a screeching halt, and the nation plunged into the Great Depression. The dream turned into a nightmare. Banks failed, life savings vanished, factories closed, and millions lost their jobs. The optimism of the 20s was replaced by breadlines and despair. The country needed a savior, and it found one in Franklin D. Roosevelt. Elected in 1932, FDR promised a new deal for the American people. This wasn't just a political slogan. It was a revolution in the role of government. The New Deal unleashed a wave of programs, building massive dams and bridges to create jobs, establishing Social Security to provide a safety net for the elderly and unemployed, and regulating banks to prevent another crash. It was a radical experiment in government intervention that permanently reshaped the relationship between the American people and the state. While the New Deal didn't single-handedly end the Depression, it restored hope and laid the groundwork for recovery. But it would take another world war to truly pull America out of the economic abyss. As America was grappling with the Depression, storm clouds were gathering over Europe and Asia once more. Fascist regimes in Germany, Italy, and Japan were on the march, hungry for conquest. When World War II broke out in 1939, America once again tried to remain neutral. But President Roosevelt knew the threat was real. He declared that America must become the arsenal of democracy, supplying the Allies with the weapons they needed to fight the Axis powers. The nation's factories, which had been silent during the Depression, roared back to life, churning out an astonishing number of planes, tanks, and ships. Then, on December 7, 1941, everything changed. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan thrust the United States directly into the war. America was now fighting a massive conflict on 2 fronts. In Europe, American forces joined the British and Soviets to crush Nazi Germany, culminating in the heroic D-Day landings in Normandy and the final push into Berlin. In the Pacific, the U.S. fought a brutal island-hopping campaign against Japan, with epic naval battles like Midway turning the tide of the war. The conflict was brought to a stunning and controversial end in August 1945, with the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered, and the war was over. When the smoke cleared, the world was transformed. The old empires were gone for good. America stood alone, its cities untouched by the devastation of war, its industrial might unmatched, and in sole possession of the most terrifying weapon ever created. The regional power of 1900 was now, without question, a global superpower. The end of World War II didn't bring peace. Instead, it gave rise to a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. The world was now split into two camps, led by the two remaining superpowers, the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. This was a battle of ideologies, waged with spies, propaganda, and a terrifying nuclear arms race where both sides had the power to annihilate the other. The tension erupted into hot wars in places like Korea and, most divisively, Vietnam. The competition even extended into the heavens with the space race. When the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first satellite, it sent a shockwave through America. The US responded by pouring resources into science and technology. A race that culminated in 1969 with an American astronaut walking on the moon. But while America was projecting its power across the globe, a revolution was brewing at home. The civil rights movement challenged the nation's deep-seated racial injustice. Led by towering figures like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., African Americans and their allies used nonviolent protests to demand equal rights. The powerful "I Have a Dream" speech, the marches, and the sit-ins forced the country to confront its own hypocrisy. Landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act began to dismantle legal segregation. But the 60s and 70s were also a time of turmoil. The deeply unpopular Vietnam War sparked massive anti-war protests, and a counterculture movement of hippies questioned mainstream American values. The Watergate scandal, which forced a president to resign, shattered the public's trust in government. America had achieved superpower status, but internally, the cracks were starting to show. Setting the stage for the turbulent decades to come, the Berlin Wall crumbles. A sea of people celebrates. Desert sands churn under tank treads. Then, smoke billows from towers against a clear blue sky. A smartphone lights up a face. A newsfeed scrolls endlessly. This whirlwind of images, this is America since the Cold War. A nation that suddenly found itself alone at the top of the world. But when there's no equal rival left, what does a country do with all that power? That's the story we're diving into today, the final chapter in our journey through American history. As the 1980s gave way to the 90s, the world held its breath. The Soviet Union, America's adversary for nearly half a century, was dissolving. Suddenly, the bipolar world of the Cold War was gone. In its place stood what some called a unipolar moment, with the United States as the sole superpower. This wasn't just about military might. It was a cultural and economic tidal wave. The internet, still in its infancy, began connecting the globe in ways previously unimaginable. American movies, music, and brands, like McDonald's and Coca-Cola, became fixtures in nearly every corner of the planet. This new era of globalization promised a world more interconnected, more prosperous, and, many hoped, more peaceful. All under the guiding influence of American ideals. This newfound status was put to the test almost immediately. In 1990, Iraq's Saddam Hussein invaded neighboring Kuwait. The United States, leading a broad international coalition, responded with Operation Desert Storm. It was a stunning display of high-tech military dominance. Smart bombs and stealth aircraft, things that seemed like science fiction, delivered a swift and decisive victory. For many, this confirmed America's role as the world's policeman, the indispensable nation capable of enforcing a new world order. The victory was celebrated with parades, a surge of national pride, and a sense that America had truly won the Cold War and could now shape the future. It felt like the dawn of a new American century, a time of unmatched confidence and influence. But history, as always, had other plans. Tuesday, September 11, 2001. The date is etched into the collective memory of not just America but the world. On that morning, hijackers turned commercial airliners into weapons, striking the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. A fourth plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. The attacks killed nearly 3,000 people and shattered the nation's sense of security. The era of post-Cold War optimism ended in an instant. In its place came fear, anger, and a demand for justice. President George W. Bush declared a war on terror, a new kind of global conflict against a shadowy, non-state enemy, Al-Qaeda. The mission was clear: hunt down those responsible and prevent such an attack from ever happening again. The first front in this new war was Afghanistan, the country harboring Al-Qaeda's leader, Osama bin Laden. The Taliban regime was quickly toppled, but what followed was a long, grinding effort to stabilize the country and build a new government. Then, in 2003, the focus shifted to Iraq. The Bush administration argued that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed an imminent threat. Despite significant international opposition and controversy, the United States led an invasion and removed him from power. But like in Afghanistan, the initial military victory gave way to a brutal insurgency and sectarian violence. These two conflicts, in Afghanistan and Iraq, would become America's longest wars. They cost trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives, not to mention the immense human toll on the people of those nations. The wars reshaped American foreign policy, expanded government surveillance powers at home, and left a deep and lasting scar on the national psyche, fueling debates that continue to this day. Just as the nation was grappling with the consequences of its long wars, a different kind of crisis struck, this one from within. In 2008, the American economy teetered on the brink of collapse. A housing bubble, fueled by risky loans and complex financial instruments, burst spectacular fashion. Major banks and financial institutions, once thought to be untouchable, failed or required massive government bailouts. The stock market plummeted, wiping out trillions in wealth. The fallout was devastating. Millions of Americans lost their jobs. Families lost their homes to foreclosure. A sense of betrayal grew, a feeling that Wall Street had gambled with the country's future and that Main Street was paying the price. The Great Recession, as it came to be known, shattered the trust many had in the financial system and in the promise of upward mobility. This economic turmoil poured gasoline on simmering social and political fires. The gap between the ultra-wealthy and everyone else, which had been growing for decades, became a central and explosive issue. Protests like Occupy Wall Street gave voice to a generation feeling left behind. At the same time, the political landscape grew more fractured and hostile than ever. The old idea of a loyal opposition gave way to bitter partisan warfare. The country seemed to be cleaving in two: red states versus blue states, each with its own news sources, its own facts, and its own version of reality. This division was supercharged by the rise of a new force: social media. Platforms like Facebook and Twitter connected people in revolutionary ways, but they also created information bubbles and echo chambers. The spread of fake news and disinformation became a serious threat, making it harder for citizens to agree on even basic truths. America was more connected, yet more divided, than ever before. So, where does that leave the United States in the 21st century? It's a nation of profound contradictions. It remains a global leader, home to the world's most powerful military, its largest economy, and its most innovative tech companies. Yet, it's also a country facing immense challenges. The unipolar moment is over. Rising powers like China are reshaping the global balance. Existential threats like climate change demand a level of cooperation that seems increasingly difficult to achieve. And internally, America is wrestling with its own identity. Fierce debates over immigration, racial justice, and gender equality reveal deep fissures in the fabric of society. The very definition of what it means to be an American is up for grabs. This brings our long journey through American history to a close. We started with the diverse native civilizations that first called this continent home. We saw the arrival of European colonists, the birth of a new republic founded on radical ideas of liberty, and the brutal Civil War that nearly tore it apart. We watched it grow into an industrial giant, navigate world wars and a Cold War, and emerge as a global superpower. What we've seen is that the history of the United States, isn't a simple story of good or bad. It's not a triumphant march of progress or a cautionary tale of decline. Instead, it's a constant, messy, and often painful experiment in figuring out how millions of different people can live together under one flag. It's an experiment that has produced moments of incredible greatness and moments of disastrous failure. And the final chapter of this story, the one that answers the question of what comes next, well, that chapter is still being written, right now, by all of us, as you watch this video. Thanks for joining us on this journey. If you found this series valuable, please like, share, and subscribe for more.